The year was 1943, and the mighty 8th Air Force was hemorrhaging men over the skies of occupied Europe. Captain Thomas Thorne was not your typical airman. He was a flight surgeon, a man whose hands were trained to knit flesh together, not tear it apart. When he was assigned to a B-17 Flying Fortress crew, he was faced with a mechanical and moral reality that didn't exist in the sanitized halls of medical school. On a B-17, every man had a secondary job. The navigator manned the cheek guns, the bombardier manned the nose turrets. Even the radio operator had a .50 caliber machine gun to defend the ship's spine. When Thorne boarded the aircraft, the CO made it clear, "When the zeros come in, doctor, you don't just sit there. You grab the waist gun and you earn your keep." Thorne refused. It wasn't cowardice. He had volunteered for the most dangerous theater of the war. It was a matter of the Hippocratic Oath. To Thorne, the promise to abstain from whatever is deleterious and mischievous was not a suggestion. It was his identity. He argued that if he took a life, he forfeited his right to save one. He believed that the moment a medic becomes a combatant, the sanctity of the Red Cross is erased. The tension was immediate. His commanding officer threatened him with a court-martial for refusing a direct order in a combat zone. "The Germans don't care about your oath, Doc," the colonel barked. "They'll put a 20mm shell through your head whether you're holding a Bible or a Browning." Thorne stood his ground, arriving for the pre-flight briefing with a medical kit strapped to his chest and an empty holster on his hip. He was entering a world of industrial-scale slaughter with the intent to remain a healer, a decision that made him the most controversial man on the base. To the 9 other men on the B-17, now nicknamed the Reluctant Healer, Thorne was a liability. In the high-altitude pressure cooker of a bomber, survival depended on defensive fire density. If one gun was silent, it created a blind spot that German pilots could exploit. To his crewmates, Thorne's ethics looked a lot like a death sentence for the rest of them. "Must be nice to have a conscience while we're doing the dirty work," the waist gunner, a cynical sergeant named Miller, spat during their 3rd mission. Miller had to man his gun and watch the opposite side of the aircraft, doing the work of 2 men because the doc refused to touch the trigger. The resentment boiled over in the mess hall and the barracks. Thorne was isolated. He was the dead weight, the man who was willing to let his friends die to keep his own soul clean. They stopped inviting him to card games. They stopped sharing their letters from home. To them, Thorne was a tourist in their nightmare, a man who wanted the flight pay and the wings without the blood on his hands. Thorne felt the sting of the isolation, but he spent his time differently. While the others slept or drank, he studied the specific wounds caused by flak and 20mm shrapnel. He practiced tying tourniquets with one hand in total darkness. He knew that his worth wouldn't be proven with a kill count, but by what happened when the screaming started. He was waiting for the moment when the dead weight would become the only thing keeping them from the grave. The turning point came 28,000 feet over the flak-blackened skies of Schweinfurt. The mission was a meat grinder. The Reluctant Healer was boxed in by the box, a tight formation of B-17s designed for mutual protection, but the Luftwaffe had developed a new, terrifying tactic. They weren't just picking off stragglers anymore, they were diving head-on into the formation, their nose cannons blazing. The air was -40 degrees, and the cabin was filled with the rhythmic, bone-shaking thud-thud-thud of the .50 calibers. Thorne stood in the waist of the ship, his breath frosting inside his oxygen mask, his hands tucked into his armpits to keep them warm and nimble. He was surrounded by the spent brass casings of his crewmates' guns, but his own station remained cold and silent. Sergeant Miller was screaming into his throat mic, swinging his gun in a desperate arc to ward off a pair of Focke-Wulf 190s. Suddenly, the world inside the bomber turned white. A 20mm cannon shell from a German fighter punched through the thin aluminum skin of the radio room and detonated. The shockwave threw Thorne against the bulkhead. Through the swirling haze of cordite and hydraulic fluid, he heard the one sound every airman feared more than the fighters, a scream that wasn't a war cry, but a plea. The radio operator, a 19-year-old kid named Billy, had been caught in the blast. His leg was shredded, a jagged piece of the ship's own fuselage acting like a guillotine. Blood, bright, arterial red, began to mist the freezing air. At this altitude, Billy would bleed out in minutes, or his heart would stop from the sheer shock of the cold hitting his open wound. This was the moment the dead weight shifted. Thorne didn't hesitate. While the rest of the crew was pinned to their guns by the relentless German passes, Thorne unclipped his safety line and crawled into the wreckage of the radio room. The ship was bucking like a bronco, dodging flak bursts that sounded like giant doors slamming shut in the sky. Thorne worked with a cold, mechanical precision that stunned the waist gunners who stole glances back at him. He didn't have the luxury of a sterilized operating theater. He was working on a vibrating floor slick with ice and blood, wearing a bulky flight suit, with the wind howling through a 3-foot hole in the side of the plane. He didn't look at the fighters outside. He didn't look at the tracers stitching lines across the sky. He saw only the femoral artery. Using a length of rubber tubing and a pair of forceps he had kept pre-warmed against his own skin, Thorne performed a blind ligation. He reached into the mangled tissue, feeling for the pulse of the bleed, and clamped it shut. He then pumped Billy full of morphine and wrapped him in heated flight blankets. As he worked, a piece of flak sliced through the ceiling, missing Thorne's head by inches and spraying him with aluminum splinters. He didn't even flinch. He just kept his hands steady on the boy's chest, monitoring his shallow breathing. When Miller, the gunner who had mocked him, finally had a second to breathe, he looked back. He saw Thorne hunched over Billy, using his own body as a shield to keep the freezing wind off the wounded boy. The dead weight was currently the only person on the plane doing the impossible, holding back death in a place where death was the only constant. The battle for Schweinfurt was far from over. As Thorne stabilized Billy in the wreckage of the radio room, the reluctant healer was targeted by a fresh wave of interceptors. The German pilots had spotted the jagged hole in the fuselage and the lack of return fire from the starboard waist gun. They smelled blood. Sergeant Miller, who had been holding the line alone, was suddenly caught in a crossfire. A burst of machine gun fire from a Me-110 raked the side of the B-17. The heavy glass of the waist window shattered, and Miller collapsed. A bullet had grazed his temple, and shrapnel was embedded in his shoulder. The starboard gun, the ship's primary defense against the 6 o'clock high attack, went dead. Thorne heard the silence of the gun, and it was more terrifying than the roar. He looked up from Billy and saw Miller slumped over the spade grips, his blood pooling on the brass-strewn floor. If that gun stayed silent, the next German pass would saw the tail off the aircraft, killing everyone on board, including the patient Thorne had just fought so hard to save. Thorne faced a choice that his Hippocratic Oath had never anticipated. He crawled to Miller, dragging his medical kit through the red slush. With one hand, he began packing Miller's shoulder wound with sulfur powder and gauze, but his eyes were on the sky. A Focke-Wulf 190 was rolling into a firing solution, its nose-mounted cannons aiming directly at the wounded heart of the bomber. "Doc. The gun." Miller wheezed, his eyes rolling back. Thorne didn't pick up the gun to kill. In his mind, he was performing a different kind of surgery. He reached up, his fingers, still stained with Billy's blood, gripping the cold steel of the .50 caliber Browning. He didn't aim for the pilot's cockpit. He didn't seek the kill. He aimed for the space in front of the German fighter, unleashing a rhythmic, disciplined burst of lead. He wasn't a soldier. He was an obstacle. By filling the air with steel, he forced the German pilot to break his dive. The tracers created a wall of fire that shielded the hospital he had built in the back of the plane. For the next 5 minutes, Thorne operated in a surreal duality. His left hand held a pressure bandage on Miller's neck, while his right hand periodically hammered the butterfly trigger of the heavy machine gun to suppress the attackers. He was a healer defending his ward. Every time a fighter veered off, Thorne went back to Miller, checking his pupils and adjusting the oxygen flow. He was manning the guns not out of a desire to destroy the enemy, but out of a desperate primal need to protect his patients. He had found the loophole in his own ethics. He would not be an instrument of war, but he would be the shield that stood against it. When the fighters finally disengaged, Thorne was covered in a cocktail of oil, spent gunpowder, and the blood of 2 different men. He let go of the gun as if it were white-hot iron, his hands shaking. He crawled back to Billy, checked his pulse, and sat in the red-stained silence, waiting for the long, cold flight home. He had broken his rule, but he had saved the crew. Now, The only question was whether the army would reward him or break him for the way he did it. When the reluctant healer finally screeched onto the runway at Bassingbourn, it was less an airplane and more a sieve of shredded aluminum. As the engines winded down into a metallic groan, the ground crew rushed the hatches. They expected to find a charnel house. Instead, they found Captain Thorne, his face a mask of frozen exhaustion, still kneeling in the blood-slicked radio room. He was holding Billy's hand, whispering encouragement to a boy who was barely conscious, while Sergeant Miller leaned against the bulkhead, alive only because of a surgeon's steady hands and a machine gun's desperate spray. The aftermath was a legal and moral hurricane that swept through the 8th Air Force Command. Captain Thorne was immediately summoned to a closed-door hearing. On one side of the table sat the brass, colonels and generals who viewed his refusal to man a gun as a dangerous precedent for mutiny. On the other side stood the Oath, the medical board that worried Thorne had compromised the neutrality of medical personnel by touching the Browning. "You were ordered to man that station, Captain," a colonel noted, tapping a finger on the flight manifest. "By refusing, you created a hole in our formation that nearly cost us a ship. That is a court-martial offense." Then, the door opened. Sergeant Miller, his head wrapped in heavy bandages and his arm in a sling, hobbled into the room. Behind him stood the rest of the crew, men who had once called Thorne dead weight. "With all due respect, sir," Miller croaked, his voice thick with emotion, "if the doc hadn't refused to shoot until he had to, Billy would be in a coffin and I'd be at the bottom of the Rhine. He didn't just man a station. He ran a hospital at 28,000 feet. If you court-martial him, you'll have to court-martial the whole crew, because we won't fly without him." The command was stuck in a localized paradox. If they punished him for the initial refusal, they'd be punishing the man who saved a crew of heroes. If they gave him the Silver Star for the aerial combat, they'd be admitting that medics were combatants, potentially stripping all flight surgeons of their protected status under the Geneva Convention. The compromise was a masterstroke of military, gray area logic. They couldn't give a medic a combat medal for shooting a gun, so they awarded Thorne the Distinguished Service Cross for his extraordinary heroism in providing medical care under fire. The citation mentioned the defense of the aircraft in passing, but focused entirely on the surgical miracle performed in the freezing wind. They didn't court-martial him, but they did something more significant. They transferred him to a training role. They realized that Thorne's worth wasn't in his trigger finger, but in his ability to teach other medics how to survive the hospital in the sky. Thorne left the reluctant healer not as a coward or a liability, but as the man who redefined what it meant to be a healer in a world of killers. He had proven that a man could hold onto his soul and his duty at the same time, provided he was willing to bleed for both. The legacy of Thorne's mission manifested in the immediate restructuring of aircrew training. The Thorne case was studied at the School of Aviation Medicine, leading to the formalization of the flight medic role. No longer would surgeons be expected to be auxiliary gunners. Instead, they were trained to be technical healers. The military realized that Thorne's refusal to shoot wasn't about a lack of courage, but about a surplus of focus. A man worrying about his lead drift cannot track the fluctuating pulse of a man in shock. Thorne helped design the first aeromedical kits that were standard issue by 1945. These weren't just bags of bandages. They were organized, compact trauma units designed to be used in the high-vibration, sub-zero environment of a bomber. He insisted on the inclusion of plasma and portable oxygen delivery systems for wounded airmen, saving thousands of lives in the final years of the war. More importantly, his story codified the Med Shield doctrine. It established that while a medic should never be a primary combatant, they have an inherent right to defensive action to protect their patients. This nuance allowed medics to carry sidearms for the sole purpose of defending the wounded, a standard that persists in modern rules of engagement. When Thorne returned to civilian life after the war, he rarely spoke of the guns or the Focke-Wulfs. He went back to a quiet practice in a small town, his hands, once stained with the oil of a .50 caliber, now gently tending to the local children. But on his wall, tucked behind his medical degree, was a small, framed photo of AB-17 crew. In the center was Billy, standing tall on a prosthetic leg, and Miller, with a faint scar on his temple. They were alive because one man decided that, do no harm, was a command worth fighting for.